Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to National PTA's webinar on Federal Appropriations 101. I'm Josh Westfall, the Government Affairs Manager at National PTA, and I'll be one of the speakers on the webinar today. And we also have Jacqueline Thomas, the Legislative Assistant for Senator Chris Coons of Delaware. Before we get started today, to go over a few housekeeping rules. This webinar is being recorded and will be uploaded to the pta.org website in 24 to 48 hours after the conclusion of the webinar. Feel free to share this webinar far and wide with all of your members and through your newsletters. At this time, all attendees on this webinar have their lines muted, so if you have any questions for both of us, for either me or Jacqueline, please direct your comments to the question box on the right-hand side of your webinar screen. My colleague Lindsay Kabotsky will be watching the question box and will let us know if any questions are clarifying questions to be answered right away, or if we can wait for the questions to be answered at the end of the webinar. We have about 15 to 20 minutes separated at the end of this webinar to go through some more questions and ask both me and Jacqueline those. And if your questions do not get answered during that time, please feel free to email governmentaffairs@pta.org, which is govtaffairs@pta.org. So today we're going to discuss the appropriations powers of Congress. Then we're going to discuss some key terms for appropriations to kind of guide us through the webinar and go through some common terms. Then I'll guide us through the appropriations process and timeline and go step by step of how it works, followed by National PTA's funding priorities in the main education programs that we are following on an annual basis. Then I'll turn this over to Jacqueline, who will talk about the current appropriations process and what's happening on the Hill. And then she will also give us her perspective on how to effectively advocate for appropriations. So without further ado, let's begin. So in Article 1, Section 9 of the U.S. Constitution, it grants Congress the power of the purse. And in the actual Constitution, it directly states, no money shall be drawn from the U.S. Treasury, but in consequence of appropriations made by law. And that's really a very formal and drawn-out way of saying Congress must approve all federal spending. So as it's in the Constitution, that is how our system is set up, that all spending needs to be discussed each year. In this way, we approve all the discretionary spending that we work through. So that is kind of what has started the process from our founding fathers of annual appropriations. And that is why each year we begin this process. So to go over a few key terms that sometimes get muffled in the conversations, or you might hear a lot on the news or in some of our updates. We will go through a few of those to begin. So one of the main areas that often get misconstrued is authorizations versus appropriations. So authorizations are the suggested amount of money that federal law allows a program to be funded at. And the emphasis really here is the suggested amount. That is a recommendation from those members of Congress and from those authorizers. It doesn't mean that they will actually be funded at that amount. It's just saying we think this program is important and we think it deserves this amount of money, and now we leave it to you appropriators to discuss it. So the example on the bottom of your screen, as many of you know, one of the main programs that we support and advocate for is statewide family engagement centers. So in the Every Student Succeeds Act, that amount was authorized at $10 million. But as many of us know, last year and this year, we have not seen actual appropriations. No money has actually been dedicated to statewide family engagement centers. We just have the option of it being there. So at this time, again, it's authorized. It is in law that it's a program that should be considered, and that is where we fight for appropriations to move forward. So for authorizing committees, so there are two examples on your screen. An authorizing committee on the Senate side that we work with all the time is the Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee, or also known as the HELP Committee. On the House side, it's the House Committee on Education and the Workforce. So again, these are the committees that work through programs, create laws that you have to follow in order to receive funding, and it gives those suggested amounts. So an example at the bottom of your screen is that before the Every Student Succeeds Act, the House had their own bill called H.R. 5, the Student Success Act. And that bill itself authorized $16 billion for Title I money. Well, even in today's appropriations, we have not seen $16 billion for Title I. But that was the House Committee's way of saying Title I is an important program. We are going to give it a large amount of money, or we're going to authorize a large amount of money to show to the appropriators that it is important. So that is another important part of authorizers, is that when they put down those amounts, although it might not be funded there, they show what should be highlighted, what is recommended, what is a priority for them. So if you want to see on the website, when you go on house.gov, and when you click on committees, all of these committees listed, except for the appropriations ones, are authorizers. You have agriculture, you have the budget, here's the education and the workforce. And when you go to the Senate side, when you click on committees, also in these standing committees, these also list all of the authorizing committees. And if you see, here's Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions. So all these except for the ones that are clearly labeled appropriations are authorizing committees. So now we go to the appropriations side. So again, authorizers, they create the law and they give the ideas, and appropriations is the amount of money actually provided for a program. So, and again, the part to emphasize is actually provided. So this is where we see each year appropriators go through program by program and decide this is what it should be funded at, these programs should receive decreases, these ones increases, these programs stay the same. So an example again with our priority program, the Statewide Family Engagement Centers, that was not funded in fiscal year 2016. And in fiscal year 2017, we're still working towards that. So although it was authorized at $10 million, we have not actually seen appropriations for it yet. We are very optimistic that this is our year, and it will be, especially with everyone's advocacy efforts. So an example of an appropriations committee, and the one that we work with the most, is the Labor, Health, and Human Services, Education, and Related Agencies Appropriations Subcommittee. And I know that's a mouthful, so normally they just call it L-HHS-ED, or even shorter, L-HHS, but that is, again, that covers, as you see in the title, the Department of Education, the Department of Labor, and the Department of Health and Human Services. So it is a very, very large appropriations bill. It covers many departments and many programs. That's also why when you see in this, when you see with this appropriations bill, why it's one of the last bills to move in Congress, and why it's one of the few that make it all the way through to the finish line each year, is because it has all of these big programs. You have health and NIH, which is the National Institutes of Health, and you also have the Department of Education. And you have to choose which ones are getting funding based on how much funding you have. So it's a lot of hard decisions for congressmen to make, which is why our bill takes a lot of advocacy efforts. And all year round, we're pushing for greater investments in education. So to give an example, in fiscal year 2016, the U.S. Department of Education was funded at $68 billion. That was the final bill. It was funded at $68 billion. For this year, working through the L-HHS Education Subcommittee on Appropriations, There's the House side, which would like to fund the Department of Education at $66 billion. And then there's the Senate side, and the Senate L-HHS Education Appropriations Subcommittee that would like to fund the U.S. Department of Education at $67 billion. So to show you also on what it looks like on the internet, when you click on appropriations, this is where we're actually funding each program year to year and where the debates start. So within this appropriations, if you go under subcommittees, it lists all 12 subcommittees. And for the House and the Senate, the subcommittees are the same. So you can see here's Labor, Health, and Human Services and Education. When we go to the Senate side, again, you're under committees. You click on appropriations. And again, under subcommittees, here are the 12 subcommittees. And here's Labor, Health, and Human Services, education-related agencies. So this is, again, where you find that those appropriations. And this is where you can look up what the committee is doing, what they're proposing, where the funding's coming from. And our last set of definitions to, again, kind of start this off is discretionary programs versus mandatory programs. So for discretionary programs, these are programs that must have their funding renewed each year in order to continue operating. So again, these are programs that every single year have to go through the appropriations process, and every year it has to be reanalyzed and reappropriated. So to many of you, there's no surprise that Title I schools and the Title I program is clearly a discretionary program, because some years we see increases and some years we see decreases. School meals, that's something else that's on the discretionary side. But there's a lot of programs on the discretionary side. There's defense, there's NASA, and very, very relevant for today, or today's world, there's Zika. So not only do you have all of these programs that are fighting for money and appropriations and split across 12 subcommittees, all going towards a very large, a $1 trillion pot for discretionary programs, but there's also a lot of competition that might change from year to year. So back in 1990, we didn't know about Zika. We didn't see Zika. There was no health concern for the United States for Zika virus. But now, funding for that in order to make sure that we're helping with that defense and then that health problem, that now that is taking into some of our discretionary programs. So we have to find a way to pay for that and pay for Title I in our education programs. So again, that's why these year-to-year battles always change, because different things come about. So then there's also mandatory programs. And mandatory programs are programs that are not considered annually and are not controlled by the annual appropriations process. So these are, these are appropriations that go in year to year. They're not decided on, they're in law, and it doesn't matter how much money there is. What matters is how many people are involved in the system, the way that the actual program is set up. So there is no top line number for Social Security. If we hit, and I'm making up these numbers, if we hit $4 trillion in Social Security one day, there's no top line number for that. What it's based on is how many people are in Social Security, how many people are in the Medicare program, and how many people are Medicaid. And no matter how many, and depending on how many people are in there, is how much funding automatically has to go into those programs. They're mandatory. It comes every year, and it's part of the budget process. And in order to change that, you need to actually change the law. So looking at the big picture here, as you see, we fight extremely hard on the discretionary program side. Us, along with the other 11 appropriation subcommittees, all work on our programs to get them funded year in and year out. But as you can see, there is more funding that goes into the mandatory side, which is really the untouchable side, the side that gets money every single year. and that's 2/3 of our federal budget. That's around the $2 trillion mark is just for mandatory. And we are fighting for that 32%, that $1 trillion amount that is broken up into 12 subcommittee appropriations bills. And in this discretionary amount, this is where you see things again, like, again, our Department of Education program, you see defense programs, you see agriculture, but you also see other things like the Zika virus funding. You see funding for lead in schools for Flint, Michigan. You see the flooding in Louisiana and finding discretionary appropriations for that. So that 32% becomes very complicated over time when it's always changing and you only are dealing with 1/3 of the entire budget. So now moving into appropriations. So the fiscal year that starts appropriations starts on October 1st is when the fiscal year starts. This is when us appropriations gurus and nerds are popping champagne and throwing confetti. Obviously, I am only partially joking on that. It usually depends on how well our programs are faring that year. If it's going well, absolutely we do that, and if not, well, we start fighting for the next year. So on October 1st, the fiscal year starts. Then in January, in mid-January, the president makes his or her State of the Union address, and in that State of the Union address is where you start to see the administration's priorities come about. It's one of the first few times you see it, and especially in this upcoming year, it will be very exciting to see what the State of the Union address is about, because that's when we're going to see the new president and their priorities. So in February, usually the first week of February, the president submits a proposed budget to Congress. And a proposed budget to Congress, it's not law, it doesn't get signed into law, there's no actual backing for that. It's exactly what it is, a proposal. So it's the president's priorities and where they think that the funding should be. And Congress can decide to take it into consideration, or it can decide not to. It also highly involves party lines and where that intermixes as well. So again, President Obama in these last years, he has submitted a proposal all 8 years for the budget, and each year Congress decides which areas that they want to follow the president on and which ways they don't. So things like early education, we have seen more funding for early education. That was a priority for the president, and Congress decided to take that up. But in some other areas, like teacher prep programs, things like computer science, we have not seen nearly as much appropriations for. That's a priority for the president, but we have not seen that same amount of appropriations. So again, it's just a proposal, and Congress can decide. So on our end, we support things like Title I and IDEA funding, which we'll talk about later, and those fare pretty well in the president's proposal, both in most of Obama's proposals. But things like the Statewide Family Engagement Centers program, that was not in the president's proposal. So although we would have liked to see it there, and that would have definitely been helpful to see it there, it's not an end game. The fight's not over. It's just the start. And as you can see through this last year, it might not have been in the budget, but we have been pushing. We've been talking to Congress, and we've been looking for answers. So the fight still continues. Then we go to April. In April is really from March to April. The primary focus goes to the House and Senate budget committees. So in these budget committees, they work on what they call a budget resolution, which is where Congress sets the spending limits for the next fiscal year. They go through all of the programs. They go through spending from the past. They see how much taxes are involved and what kind of spending we have for the future, and they come up with a budget resolution or again their fiscal guideline of where we should be. So from the budget resolution is where you get that top line number. This year we are willing discretionarily to spend $1 trillion. And that's usually called 302As. is when it's the top number in discretionary spending that they are willing to spend for the year is called a 302A, and that's what it's referred to. Now, from that, then there's a thing called 302Bs, which is when all 12 of those subcommittees that I showed you both in the House and Senate side, then they get their top line numbers. So then they see how much funding they have to work with. And again, those are called 302Bs. So, for instance, in fiscal year 2016, the top line number for spending was around $1 trillion. It was a little bit over $1 trillion. And that was the 302A. The 302B for Labor, Health, and Human Services and Education, the subcommittee that we work on that funds the Department of Ed, the House suggested $153 billion for that subcommittee. So they have $153 billion to work with. And the Senate also decided to give $153 billion for their Labor, Health, and Human Services and Education subcommittee. So for that committee, they have to work within those grounds, within $153 billion. And then again, that's split up into the Department of Ed, the Department of Labor, the Department of Health and Human Services. But that's where that comes from. And that's where, from May to July, 12 appropriations bills are introduced, marked up, and voted on in committee. So, and again, the next slide will discuss this more, where I actually go through the process of the appropriations process in these committees. But after each subcommittee gets their top line number, their 302B of how much they have to work with, then they can introduce a bill that goes through each program and says, we should fund it at this amount. And that's the introduction. And then there's the markup, which is when the committee discusses what they like about the bill, any changes they want on it, and then they vote on the bill to start moving forward throughout the process. And then in August is congressional recess. So for the entire month, that's when you see a lot of members of Congress back in their district. It's a great time to get to know your members of Congress, to keep fighting for things like appropriations, to keep fighting for the issues that we support and for every child. That's the best time to build those relationships, because appropriations happens every single year. So the more you know the staff, the more you know the member of Congress, the better off you are. So now we're going to go through the actual appropriations process, and you'll kind of see it in an animated way on your screen right now. And again, this process works in the House, and this exact same process works through the Senate as well. So the first thing that happens, again, is in that April month is those budget allocations. This is where the Budget Committee comes out with that top number, and it gives each subcommittee their top number, their number to work with for the year. You have all these programs, and you have this amount to work with. This, you know, in the Labor, Health, and Human Services and Education subcommittee, it's $153 billion that you have to work with. So once those come out in April, then we see that, again, that it goes to that subcommittee. So the subcommittee receives the amount of money, and then they start working on a bill. They start talking about what programs they're going to include, at what levels. They start the rough drafts, and it begins. Once the pen goes to paper, then they call a subcommittee markup, and they go through the bill. And each member gets to give amendments, start with debates, give speeches about certain programs, what they think the funding should be at, and then after the discussion is over, they take a vote on the bill. Can you agree that this bill and the funding for these programs can move forward? And if the bill is voted on and it's voted on favorably, then it moves to the full committee. So again, you have the Labor, Health, and Human Services Education Subcommittee, and then you have the other 11 subcommittees, which could be, you know, Homeland Security, it could be Energy and Water, it could be Commerce, Justice, and Science. All of those are subcommittees. So once the Labor, Health, and Human Services Subcommittee meets to talk about the bill and approves it, Then it goes to the full Appropriations Committee, which is when all 12 Appropriations Committee members come together into one setting and discuss just that bill, just the Labor, Health, and Human Services and Education bill. And again, they go through the markup. They look at the bill, they offer amendments, they debate it, they discuss it, and then they vote on it. If the vote goes favorably, then it goes to the full floor. So once the House Appropriations Committee meets and discusses a bill, and if it gets voted favorably and voted yes on, it goes to the House floor. 435 members will vote on it. In the Senate, once the Senate Appropriations Committee votes on the Labor, Health, and Human Services bill, then it goes to the Senate floor, where 100 senators will vote on that bill. If the bill is voted on favorably, then both sides, you have to wait for both sides to happen, or sometimes there are pre-conferences, but a conference committee forms. And this is where the House, in the example of Labor, Health, and Human Services, the House bill for Labor, Health, and Human Services, their committee members and their bill gets discussed, and the Senate Labor, Health, and Human Services bill, those people both come in the same room that are chosen, and they start working out the differences, because oftentimes programs are funded at different levels. So if you look at it might be a little bit hard to read, but the description on the cartoon says, actually, this happened before the earthquake. There's a line right through the Capitol, because the House can be very different than the Senate. So they work through their differences, and they come together on a bill that will be able to be passed on both sides and that both parties and chambers will be able to agree with. Once both bills come in together into one conference bill, then it goes back to both chambers for a vote. So both bills come together into one main one, and then that main bill goes to the House. The House votes on the bill. If it votes favorably, then it goes to the Senate. The Senate votes on that combined bill, and if it passes both the House and the Senate, then the President has a chance to sign the appropriations bill into law. So this process goes through for each appropriations bill. So there are 12 appropriations bills based on the 12 subcommittees. This process goes through for each one of those. So this is going to happen for defense. This is going to happen for energy and water. So the President, again, based on the actual, the normalcy of doing appropriations, the President should be signing 12 appropriations bills a year. However, for those of you keeping up on the news and our updates and everything else, we have seen that doesn't always happen. And in the recent times, we have not seen that normal process happen for a while. So what happens when September 30th hits and we have not passed all 12 appropriations bills, or when the timeline is getting close? Well, when that happens, if appropriations are not passed by September 30th, or if something doesn't happen, that is when you see things like a government shutdown. But there are other methods to pass bills and keep the process continuously going so that you don't have to shut down the government, because clearly members of Congress and constituents and citizens of the United States do not want to see a shutdown. So what you see the most often is called a continuing resolution, or a CR. This is pretty much where you continue funding the government programs at last year's amount. So if last year's Title I received $14 billion, this year you receive the exact same amount. If last year's defense spending was multi-billion dollars, this year that exact same amount will happen again. It's a continuing resolution. And that can come in all ways. You can do it for the entire year. You can do it for a few months just to keep the discussions going. So in this year's case, there was a CR pass on September 28th that then pushed the process to December 9th. So from there, come December 9th, we have to start seeing appropriations bills again. We need to start seeing funding for next year. If the Congress decides not to do a continuing resolution, then Congress can do what they call an omnibus. So instead of working through 12 separate bills and having the President sign 12 appropriations bills, the Congress can decide to start combining all the bills into one, which is, again, so instead of calling it L-HHS and Defense and Energy and Water, it's all those programs are going to be listed in one bill, and it's going to be an up or down vote with discussion on one massive bill of funding, and that is an omnibus. Now, you also sometimes see that, you also might hear the words a minibus, and that's where out of the 12 appropriations bills, 3 of them are combined, and then an additional 4 are combined, and then one passes by itself. That's where you start seeing, again, some differences. But in general, a CR is continuing funding from last year's amount, and an omnibus is when you combine all the bills into one and you try to pass it at one time. So now we're going to start getting into some of the programs that we work on. But before then, there are a few just, again, some key terms that we should go over to make sure that all of it makes sense once we start going through each program. So the first one is formula funding. This is non-competitive funding from the federal government to states and school districts based on a predetermined formula. So an example of formula funding would be Title I. It is based on the number of low-income students in a school district. And IDEA, the amount of children with disabilities in a school district. That's how those funds are based, off the formula of how many students there are and the proportion of doing that. Then there are competitive grant programs. And these are federal funding that states and school districts or a consortia of organizations with school districts can apply for based on a specific criteria. So the Department of Ed comes out and says, we want to offer money for statewide family engagement centers, and we will allow any state or consortia to apply as long as they fill out this application and can prove that they can do these 7 steps. So an example of competitive grants are things like parent training information centers and statewide family engagement centers. Then there are also block grants. Block grants are federal funding, usually in large sums, to states and school districts to be used more generally rather than for specific programs. And it really allows for the flexibility of school districts to use money based on the needs that they have. That also sometimes means that some things might not be funded at all if a school district decides that there are other important areas to fund instead. So again, it gives them that general flexibility. So National PTA's funding priorities. What are our main priorities? Well, to no surprise, Title I, statewide family engagement centers, Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, Parent Information and Training Centers, and the Student Support and Academic Enrichment Grants, which is Title IV-A, and that is a new block grant that is part of the Every Student Succeeds Act. So we will get into that in some future slides. But so these programs are all of National PTA's main funding priorities through the Department of Education and those programs. But this is not by any means a comprehensive list. These are the main programs, again, under the Department of Ed that we're watching. But we're also watching other programs under the Department of Ed. And there are some areas that are not in the Department of Ed. So child nutrition, that's in the agriculture bill. That is some areas of funding that we are looking for. There is the Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention Act and programs under there. That is under the Commerce, Justice, and Science Subcommittee on Appropriations. So we often support funding for that as well. But for this webinar, we're just concerned about the Education Department and those programs. So, Title I. Title I, the goal is to improve academic achievement for disadvantaged students. This is really a program of equity. Regardless of family income or the zip code that students might live in, all students deserve a quality education. And that's what Title I has set out to do, is to make sure that each student gets a quality education. Title I is the largest federal K-12 education program, serving 56,000 public schools and over 20 million children. And then Title I-A funds, which is for school districts, is based on the number of low-income students in each school. So this, again, gets back to that formula funding. You're not applying for this. It's based on how many low-income students you have in your school, and how much money the state receives tells the school district how much money they are receiving for Title I. In general, Title I is a program that is of great importance to us and can always use more funding. It could be double the amount. Well, we need at least double the amount of Title I funding to give adequate supports for education opportunities for our children. Right now, it's about $20 billion underfunded. So in Title I, there are provisions for parent and family engagement. So not only is Title I itself important for school districts in making sure all schools receive all students receive an equitable education, but it's also important for the family engagement aspects. So again, under Title I-A is where the school districts receive their funding from. So school districts must reserve at least 1% of Title I-A funds for family engagement activities. So and school districts so after you do the calculations of reserving how much Title I-A funds, 1% of Title I-A funds, if that reservation for family engagement is above $5,000, you have to use it for family engagement. If it's below $5,000, then the school still has to do family engagement activities, but it doesn't have to dedicate that money towards it. It's only if that family engagement money is over $5,000 that amount of money has to be used for family engagement opportunities. And if you look for those school districts that reserve that 1% and need to use it towards family engagement, in the Every Student Succeeds Act, there is provisions of how that money is used. It's used for professional development, for school administrators, for family members, and for teachers to all work together on family engagement opportunities and best ways to communicate. It's for home and community programs and for those areas, for sharing best practices and disseminating information, for collaborating with organizations and areas that have research and best practices for family engagement, working with those groups and organizations to get that into the school. And then also at other activities that supports the school district's family engagement policies. Another program that we work on is the statewide family engagement centers. To no surprise to most of you on this webinar, that is one of our priorities, especially for fiscal year 2017, as it is a reauthorized and improved program in the Every Student Succeeds Act. So the statewide family engagement centers is part of Title IV, Part E. It is an improved version of the Parent Information and Resource Centers, so also known as PIRCs. So the PIRC program was included in No Child Left Behind from 2000 to 2010. That's when it received funding from, and then based on budget caps and hard times with the federal budgets, and when we started limiting spending, the Congress decided to cut funding for PIRC programs, and which kind of, minus a few programs in a few states like Kansas and Colorado, there are no more PIRC programs. But in ESSA, they reauthorized this program, and now it's renamed to be called Statewide Family Engagement Centers. And Statewide Family Engagement Centers are competitive grant programs for statewide organizations or a consortium of them to provide direct services to families and schools, to build capacity in the states, to do better best practices and evidence-based family engagement activities, and for professional development and family engagement. And again, this bill, in the bill, it was authorized, which was a suggested amount of $10 million in the Every Student Succeeds Act. And we're still pushing for that to get appropriated in our annual appropriations. And again, statewide family engagement centers are a way to build on statewide and on family engagement and make sure that all schools are doing effective family engagement. Those Title I resources are already underfunded and not nearly enough to effectively engage families. So by adding this program in here and having competitive grants for it in certain states, this is what will help to make sure that there is true best practices and effective family engagement. Another program we work on is the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA. And this is the main federal program authorizing state and local aid for special education and related services. So again, this is one of the largest programs. It serves over 6.5 million students with special education, which is about 13% of public school students. The federal government had promised in the authorization of IDEA that it would cover 40% of the excess costs of educating students with disabilities. And to this day, the federal government has never met that requirement, that commitment to 40%. Currently, the federal government is only funding IDEA at 16%, and the highest it's ever funded IDEA at was around 18%. So it's far from that 40%, and it's something that the National PTA and all of our members should consistently push for, is making sure we fulfill that commitment to make sure every student receives a quality education, including students with special education, students with disabilities. Another program that we work on is the Parent Training Information Centers, or PTI centers. And PTI centers they support family engagement for students with disabilities. These are state centers that provide information and resources and trainings for parents to learn more about certain disabilities, and for parents and children to learn their rights under IDEA, and for resources in states and communities for parents to best help their children, and for schools as well. So there are more than 100 PTIs nationwide, serving more than 17 million parents and families, and there's at least one PTI in each state. There are also some things called the Community Parent Resource Centers, or CPRCSs, which do the same thing as PTIs, but focus on underserved parents of children with disabilities. And the last program that we're going to talk about for today is the Student Support and Academic Enrichment Grants. This is the new flexible block grant program in Title IV Part A of the Every Student Succeeds Act. And this is a way, again, that school districts have the flexibility to use the money to best help their students. The way that the money is situated is, again, based on a competitive block grant. That's for Title I. It's based on Title I funding. So there are three areas that are used for this block grant. There's the well-rounded education and opportunities, which is you could use it for things like civics education, art programs, music and STEM, advanced courses. Then there's also the foster safe and healthy, supportive, and drug-free environments. And this is for things like school counseling, bullying prevention, mental health, and drug violence preventions. And then the last area is the increased access to personalized learning opportunities using technology. So these funds can be used for personalized learning, purchasing devices and equipment, and training teachers on effective uses of data for instruction. So again, it's that flexibility that school districts can use the money for any one of these areas as their students see the need for. So a quick breakdown. This shows the past few fiscal years and what we've now seen in the House and in the Senate. Again, the U.S. Department of Education, the Senate is looking to keep it around the same amount from last year, and the House is looking to cut the U.S. Department of Education in their bill by around $1.3 billion. In Title I spending, it's around the same from last year to what the House and Senate has proposed in their Labor, Health, and Human Services bills. And for statewide family engagement centers, again, this is one of our main priorities. We have not seen it. There has not been funding allocated towards statewide family engagement centers in the House or the Senate, and it hasn't been funded since 2010. So a quick look at the funding chart. So this is including perks and statewide family engagement centers. So as you can see, there was funding for family engagement programs from 2000 to 2010, with the largest hike being at $42 million in 2003. But again, because of those the funding times and budget caps, they cut funding from 2011 until now, and we are still looking to get that funding back now, again, with that reauthorized and improved program called Statewide Family Engagement Centers. Then you see IDEA Part B, which is for students with disabilities from age 3 to 21, around the same amount of funding, PTIs, and then the last part is that block grant, the Student Support and Academic Enrichment Grants, Again, this is a new block grant program, so you did not see funding in FY 2015 or 2016. But the House has proposed $1 billion for that flexible block grant program, and the Senate proposed $300 million in their bill. So now I will turn this over to Jacqueline to give an update about federal appropriations and to go into, again, what you can expect for effective advocacy from a staffer's perspective.
Thanks so much, Josh, and thank you all for calling in. Great to see a lot of people on the call, or see the numbers of the people on the call. So my name's Jacqueline. I work in Senator Chris Coons' office, and Senator Coons is on the Appropriations Committee, so it's given us a good insight into the appropriations process. So where we are at right now, Josh gave a very great overview of the funding cycles. Think of, the fiscal year as just a continuous cycle. So if Congress isn't writing something, right now we're in the October window, so that's really when each individual agency is working on their own proposal, which will get unveiled during the State of the Union. I think you mentioned the budget normally comes out in February. When you have a new administration coming in, as we will, the budget may be a little bit delayed until maybe April, so you might see a little bit of a slowdown. But where we are right now on the congressional side, recently the President signed into law the short-term continuing resolutions. We also say the CR, the short-term CR. That will extend funding for the government. So you might have read a few articles about, oh, are we going to have a government shutdown? We are not right now. We have government funding in place through December 9th. So that deadline will be approaching, and we will have to come up with funding for the rest of the appropriations bills that we haven't passed. So we have the MILCON military and other related agency bill that passed, which included the Zika funding, and that was passed. But we have 11 remaining appropriations bills that we have to get done. So Senator McConnell, who is the majority leader here in the Senate, had recently, just around the time we passed the CR a couple weeks ago, echoed support for House Speaker Paul Ryan's call to pass several, what Josh mentioned, minibuses. So minibuses would conceivably be packages, small packages of 3 or 4 of the remaining spending bills. So maybe you couple labor, HHS with, transportation, or maybe, some other kinds of combination. So that's been talked about as a potential way to pass bills. However, that, as you can imagine, is a pretty time-consuming process, and we don't have that many legislative days where Congress is actually in session remaining through the end of the year. So what may happen is we may do several packages or minibuses that may pass prior to that December 9th deadline, or we may do what Josh mentioned, a single omnibus, where we merge all of the 11 bills into one and basically pass it before midnight of December 10th. Essentially, we need to get our new funding levels passed. So, Josh mentioned that you all are advocates and can do a lot to actually shape the trajectory and the funding levels, and I thought I would share just kind of what is helpful for coming in and talking to staff members on the Hill when you all do your advocacy days. So as we mentioned, it's an ongoing cycle, and in the beginning of the year, after the President's budget has been released, right around the time of February and March on the Hill, various members, at least, and I'm only speaking from the Senate side, there's a similar but kind of different process that's happening on the House side. So you have to remember, there's 2 appropriations processes playing out, both in the House and the Senate. So on the Senate side, I can speak to that a little bit more. We actually we will have what are called multi-member letters. So Senator Coons, for instance, this year actually led what's called a multi-member letter in support of funding for statewide family engagement centers. He joined his colleague, Senator Jack Reed of Rhode Island, in leading that letter. And what those letters are actually, they're 1 or 2 pages normally, and they will be sent to the relevant ranking and chair of the relevant subcommittee. So, for example, for statewide family engagement centers, my boss and Senator Reed developed a letter that said, dear Senators Blunt and Murray. So Senator Blunt is the chair of the Labor HHS Appropriations Subcommittee, and then Senator Murray is the ranking member. So you might see a letter addressed to them asking for funding for the statewide family engagement centers, and that's a great opportunity to actually, go to your congressional members and say, hey, there's this letter being led by, Senator Coons and Senator Reed of Rhode Island. We would love for you to support that letter. And usually we'll have some kind of a deadline. A lot of times that process plays out, like I said, in February or March, because each subcommittee has their own deadline of when they want to receive all members' requests. So typically for the Labor HHS bill, that is sometime in April. It can be March. These deadlines shift, so it's really important to kind of get to your members of Congress as soon as you can. I would suggest the February-March period. And you might ask, please sign on to this multi-member letter. If there's not a letter that's being led, you can still, of course, reach out to your members of Congress to talk about your funding priorities. And one way that's super useful is constituent appropriation request forms. So not every Senate office has these. A lot of offices do. We have an appropriations request form in our office, and essentially what it is you can go to our website, or if you can't find it on our website, you can call, the main Washington, D.C. office of whatever, Senate office you're calling, and say, hey, do you have a constituent appropriations request form? And what that is it's a way for individuals and organizations from the state to request congressional appropriations for a certain funding stream, say it's statewide family engagement centers. So our form, basically, you would fill it out and you would say, your organization name or your name, and say, what program you're requesting funding for, so statewide family engagement centers. And the forms will usually ask, which agency does this fall under and which office. And if you're not sure, I definitely recommend going to National PTA and working with their government affairs team, who can certainly help you in getting information you need to fill out the request. And then you give a description, and you basically put your request right into that form, and then you submit it to the office. And then typically the offices will review all of the appropriations request forms, and the senator or congressman or woman will make their decisions on what appropriations request they are going to submit to the relevant committees. So that process, like I said, is around the February-March time period. So that's a really critical time period. So if you don't want to fill out the form and you want to just call your congressional office, you can do that. You can set up an appointment with the relevant staff in the office. So, for the statewide family engagement centers, typically folks come in and meet with the education legislative assistant or legislative correspondent and talk about their priorities. And when you're coming in to kind of talk about, what are your funding priorities, it's very helpful if you have a very clear request. So, I would say kind of 3 do's, 3 don'ts. 3 do's, of course, be on time and make sure to make an appointment in advance if you can. That's always good, because it can be really hectic around here in March, really any time, but especially in March or February, whenever you are in town. And if you can't make it in person, you can certainly request a phone call with the relevant staff member, and I would imagine most folks would be happy to chat with you. And you want to provide a clear ask. So I'm requesting that statewide family engagement centers be funded at $10 million in the upcoming fiscal year. And you want to have a description of what that program does, because not all staff may be familiar with that specific program that you're coming in to ask about. So National PTA will do a really good job of, preparing you and getting you the materials, and I would very much encourage all of you to really take a good look at the materials that they share with you and some of the priorities that they're asking for. And of course, if you have state-specific information about how programs are working or have worked in the past, or how they're working in states and how you want to, bring that to your own state, I think that's all really super helpful information. And, I said do's and don'ts. So I would say on the don't side, it's always good to try to schedule these meetings in advance when you're coming. We obviously want to meet with all of our constituents. It's easier to do so if those meetings are scheduled in advance. And, make sure that you have that clear ask of what you'd like to see in the funding cycle. And so I think this Appropriations 101 is super useful in actually understanding how that process works out. Sometimes we have folks that will come to us in August or September and say, hey, we want that program funded. It's really hard to do that because senators and members of Congress have already submitted their formal request in writing during that March-April period, and we've already marked up the appropriations bills at that point. So at that point, the level of decision making is really at the pretty high levels of the Appropriations Committee. So it's pretty hard to get changes to the bill that late in the process. So just to emphasize again, I think that February-March period is a really good time to come to your offices and your members of Congress and say, this program is important to me, and here are some of the relevant numbers in whatever state you're in. And I think that is probably, unless I'm missing any other information, Josh, that you'd like me to touch on, I would say, make a clear ask, come early enough in the process, and always, try to make sure to follow up after your meetings. That's another key thing I didn't mention. You'll have a meeting on the Hill, or you'll have a phone call. It's always great to follow up with whoever you spoke with and just write a summary email of what you discussed and what your request is. So it was great meeting you, and as we discussed, we would love to see statewide family engagement centers funded at $10 million in the labor HHS appropriations bill. So as specific as you can be, that will be helpful, because if you come in and say we want help, we want to help, it's a lot harder for us to be able to be strategic about how to be helpful. Thanks. Josh, I'll send it back to you.
Just a quick update. We also want to save the date. So again, we have our 2017 National PTA LegCon from March 7th to the 9th. It's in the Crystal Gateway Marriott here in Arlington, Virginia. It would be at the exact same hotel that there was last year. So mark your calendars, send out emails, put it in your newsletters, and when we share these slides afterward, these are hyperlinks to our PTA webpage. So you can find this at pta.org/LegCon. And also, it just opened up this week, our 2017 Advocacy Award applications. We have individuals, we have state, then we have youth awards, and we have congressional awards. It will all be found on our website at pta.org, and if you look under advocacy, there's the awards section. You can also find it on our PTA LegCon site, because again, these awards, once you apply for them and they're chosen, the awardee will be presented with these at LegCon. So all the information is online. We encourage everyone to apply far and wide. You can self-nominate yourself or others. So we're looking again, gearing up for another exciting year for LegCon. So please check out these links and apply and save the date. You can also follow us on our social media, of course, our website at pta.org, and we have Facebook and Twitter. A lot of our announcements come through there. And please check in about 24 to 48 hours for a recording of this webinar.